Masechet Gittin Daf Mem Zayin. We'll have two more Mishnayot today in the series of enactments that the rabbis made Mipnei Tikkun Ha'olam. Hamocheret asmo ve'et banav legoyim en podin oto. Aval podin et habanim la'achar mitat avihen. If someone sells himself and his children as slaves to non-Jews, so now they are taken by these non-Jews, we do not redeem them. Even though we saw in the previous Mishnah that it's a great mitzvah to redeem someone who is taken captive or taken as a slave. In this case, we don't, because he was not taken against his will. He sold himself into slavery. So he put himself in that position, so we're not going to help him while he is alive. We don't have help his children either while he's alive. However, after that father dies, and now it's just the children that are there, then we do redeem them, because there's no reason to penalize the sons. They didn't do anything wrong. Their father is the one that took them with him into slavery, and so therefore that would just fall into a regular case of redeeming of someone who's captive or someone who's a slave to non-Jews. It's not good for them to be there, first of all because they're slaves, and also because they're living among non-Jews and they'll learn their idolatrous ways. Okay, but for the father himself, we're not going to redeem them, because we actually want to discourage anyone from doing that. And the danger is, if we keep redeeming them, then this person will go sell himself into slavery, he'll get into debt, sell himself, and then everybody will redeem him and basically pay his debt that way. So we don't want to encourage that type of terrible behavior. Amad Aseh, Vehu Shemachad Veshana Veshilesh. Rav Aseh limits the Mishnah and says that's only if someone sold himself a second and third time. But if he did it just once, he's down and out, and he couldn't pay back a loan, and he got taken captive or sold himself, had to sell himself into slavery. If it happened one time, so then we're going to help him out. Poor guy. But if he does this repeatedly, then that shows this is just his MO. He takes loans, doesn't pay them back, and says, don't have to worry about it. The community will raise money to redeem me. So in that case, only if he does it repeatedly, then we don't. Now we're going to have a series of 3 stories about different people that sell themselves into slavery. Hanhu bene so there's people that lived in this place, they borrowed money from non-Jews, and then they didn't have enough money to repay. So these the lenders came and seized them and took these Jews as slaves. So they came to Rav Huna. It's not clear who came, because they already are in slavery, but maybe they sent a message, or their relatives came to Rav Huna and said, can you help us raise money from the community to help redeem them and get them out of this slavery to non-Jews? And Rav Huna says, I'm sorry, I wish I could help, but I have to follow the law in the Mishnah that says someone who sells himself into slavery, we do not redeem them. But another rabbi who was there said, hold on, Rav Huna, you taught us that this halacha, this tikkun, takana, only applies if someone sells himself 2 and 3 times. But if it's only one time, then we should redeem him. So how come you don't apply that and redeem him? And he said, Amar le, hane meragal regile davdi hachi. When I said, these people, this community here that lives in Bemichseh, they always do this. They do this repeatedly. This is their way of doing business. They'll borrow too much, not have, and plan not to pay, so that they can and sell themselves, so that the community will come redeem them and pay their loan. So no, these fall into the category of repeated offenders, and we are not going to help them. So a certain guy, he sold himself to be a gladiator. Okay, I guess he's a rough guy, tough guy, and he was willing to be a gladiator. Being a gladiator is very risky. If you win a lot, you can be a hero, and everybody will want to be your friend, and you could be a real rock star. But more likely is that you will get seriously harmed or killed. So this is not a good situation. But he might have had to, because maybe he was in debt. and so he had to sell himself to be a gladiator. Anyway, Atala Kamed to be Ameh, Amale Pirkan. And so he came to the Bi Ameh and said, listen, I'm taken by the gladiator. Well, I give myself to the gladiators, but can you raise money to redeem me? אמר להם, תנן, המוכר עצמו ואת בניו לגויים, אין פודין אותו. אבל פודין את הבנים משום קלקולה, וכל שכן אחד איכה כתלה. Now it says Rabbi Ameh said to him, but it sounds like actually Rabbi Ameh is speaking to the other rabbis first, because we're going to have a conversation between Rabbi Ameh and the other rabbis. So Rabbi Ameh said, listen, there is a Mishnah, and the Mishnah says, someone who sells himself, we do not redeem him. But if the guy dies, and it's the sons, we do redeem the sons because of kilkul, because we don't want the sons to be assimilated. So you see that although we don't want a guy to be a repeated offender, but on the other hand, we also do worry about a person being assimilated. So he says, in your case, where likely by saying remaining a gladiator, this will lead to your death. So in that case, we make an exception to the rule, even though generally we do not redeem someone who sells himself. If the result of selling himself is going to be that he may likely die, then we do raise money to redeem him. There's no point in showing him a lesson. Hey, if you do this again, well, then we're not going to redeem you, because there's not going to be again for this guy. So, he was in a tough situation. He was down and out. And even though he sold himself, if he's going to be killed, we should redeem him. Amru le Rabbanan Rabbi Ameh, ha Yisrael mumarhu dekahazu lehu le dekachil nevelot utrefot. Now, even though Rabbi Ameh was making an exception to the Mishnah to help out this guy, the other rabbi said, hold on, you don't know the character of this person. He is a rebellious Jew. He goes and eats non-kosher animals, and he doesn't care about it. So he's not worthy of being redeemed. See, this is like in the previous story with the daughters of Rav Nachman, right? There's a test to see if someone is worthy of the community getting involved and redeeming them. But Rabbi Ameh is very generous. And he says he wants to be done the chaf sechut. And he says, okay, I know he eats non-kosher, I accept that, but maybe he's doing it because of his appetite. He can't help it. He smells this non-kosher food, and he can't help himself. He's not doing it to be rebellious against Judaism. He just can't control his desire. So it's not good, but it's not so bad, and so we should still redeem him. So the other rabbi said, no, you don't understand. This guy, we've seen a lot of times, there's kosher food and non-kosher food. Side by side, same food, no problem. And he can easily fill himself up and have a good meal with the kosher food, but he, davka, goes and eats the non-kosher food because he wants to be rebellious against Judaism. This is not a good guy. He's not worthy. And then Rabbi Ameh says back to the guy who sold himself to be a gladiator and says, sorry, you have to leave. They're not allowing me to redeem you. I'm trying to help you. I'm trying to find every loophole to find merit for you, but you acted this way. You sell yourself and you go against Judaism. You're rebellious. So sorry, there is no redemption for you. Third story, Reish Lakish zaben nafshe leluda'eh, shekam behadeh hayta vegalgalta. So Reish Lakish sold himself to be a gladiator. Now the previous stories were just about some people. Now we're talking about Reish Lakish, one of the greatest sages, the student and colleague and brother-in-law of Rabbi Yochanan. We know Reish Lakish, before he became a rabbi, there's other famous story, that he himself was a gladiator. And in fact, he saw Rabbi Yochanan bathing. He saw Rabbi Yochanan was so beautiful. He thought it was a woman. And Reish Lakish jumped in to get her. Turned out to be him. And then Rabbi Yochanan says, hey, if you will come and be a rabbi, use your strength to learn Torah, then I'll let you marry my sister. And he does. So Reish Lakish in the past was a gladiator. It seems that this story is about Reish Lakish when he was young, back when he was a gladiator, and he sold himself to be a gladiator. Makes sense. Okay, so he sold himself to be a gladiator, but he had a good reason to it, as we'll see. He took a bag and a stone inside the bag. Amar Gimiri dioma batra kol debae minaihu abdi le ki hechi de lechol adameh. So Reish Lakish says, I know there's a tradition that on the final day of a captive's life, a gladiator's life, before they kill him, they ask him, what do you want? And they give him anything. Like today, someone's on death penalty, they say, what's your last meal? Ask anything you want, and we will give it to you. Why do people do that? Why would the captors be nice to the captive and give him whatever he wants, fulfill his last wish, so that the captive will forgive the captors, right? Even the captors who are taking someone hostage and killing them, or gladiators and who are throwing someone into the ring to be mauled by a lion or whatever, even they care about their own olam haba and the guilt factor. And it says, okay, listen, we're going to be nice. Anything you want for your last will, and that way you'll die more easily and forgivingly, and we won't feel like we have your blood on your hands. Okay, interesting. So Yoma Batra Amru Le'emaini halach. So now it's his final day. Listen, we're throwing you into the ring. There's no way you're going to survive this. You are going to die. But what's your last wish? Amar lehu ba'ina akmetin chu ve'otbin chu ve'kol had minai chu amchye haita ufalga. Reish Lakish has an unusual request. He says, I want to tie all of you up and have you sit, and I want to hit you 1.5 times. Right, not a big deal. I'm just gonna, slap you 1.5 times each. So for some reason they agreed to this, and they agreed them to have themselves tied up. Kamtinhu ve'otbinu kol had minayu. So the captors, they each tied themselves, so he has each of them tied up. V'kad machye had haita nefak nishmate. Now the thing is, he said, I'm going to slap you. They see that he's holding a little bag, so they think he's just going to take this, this cloth bag and slap him lightly. So they didn't think it was going to be anything. They didn't know that there was a stone in it. And so in fact, Reish Lakish was a very strong person. He's a serious gladiator. He's trained in this weapon, and he knocks them each on their head, and he actually kills each one of them till they're right nafak nishmateh. Their souls leave them. Harkine leshine. The problem is that when he kills one, the other ones are all there. They're kind of like, well, you killed that guy. They're not going to let him. So here's what he did. Reish Lakish then gritted his teeth and said, like that. As if he's getting angry at the person he just hit, to saying, what, you're laughing at me? You think that was the laughing matter? By saying that, he's showing that the guy's still alive, right? He hits him and says, oh, you think that was fun? As if the guy is laughing at him. Really, the guy's dead. But by Reish Lakish, by talking to him like that, as if he's still alive, so the other people will think that that guy's still alive, and so they're gonna just sit there and let themselves be hit. Also, Akati pashlach gabe gabai palgade haita, and he said, "Oh, you think that was funny? I'm still gonna hit you another half a time." And so the half a time sounds like it'll be less, and so Reish Lakish is making it like they're still alive and they're taking it. And so then he goes one by one and knocks the head of each one with the stone and kills all of them. Katlinu kuluhu. So you see that Lakish had a plan the whole time. He made himself, he sold himself to be a gladiator in order to infiltrate and kill all of these thugs. And so he was, I guess, a great hero because of that. All right, very interesting. Now, nefak va'ata yateb ka'achil v'shateh. Okay, he left. He came back home, and after some time, he was sitting and eating and drinking as much as he wanted, and he wasn't saving up money to take care of his family, to take care of his future. Now, so this story is actually at the end of his life, which would lead, if we say the first one was at the beginning of his life, that would be a large gap. So it's a little hard to figure out what the chronology is here. But anyway, maybe this is what he did throughout his life, that he didn't care about savings. Says, don't you want something to lie upon? In other words, when you're old, don't you want to save up something so that you can have what to rely on, a pension fund? He says, no, what do I need anything to lie on? My pillow, my my stomach is enough for me, right? I just eat whatever I want now, and I don't worry about the future. Eventually, when he died, so it could be this is he did the story when he was young, and right after he got into the habit of just eating whatever he had then and not saving up. At the end of his life, he had a small amount of saffron. That's all he had left over for all of his belongings. And even for that, he lamented that he didn't use up everything that he owned. And he said, "Oh, see, I have to leave my wealth to others." Psalm 49. That people work hard and you just leave your wealth for others, and even though it's just a small amount. Okay, what's the point of the second story is really not clear. Perhaps it means that he showed his confidence that God would provide, and he doesn't have to save from day to day. He could use up whatever he has, just use it, and the next day he'll eat something else, and he's not worried about the future. People that don't have so much faith in God, they say like, I don't know what's going to happen. I have to save a lot of money. And so he said, right, God will take care of me every day. He'll take care of my family in the future, and didn't have to worry about it. All right, that's the Mishnah and some interesting stories. Next Mishnah. Hamocher et sadehu legoy, lokech umevi mimenu bikurim mipnei tikun ha'olam. Someone who sells his field to a non-Jew. We're talking about a field in Israel, and this is not good. We want the land of Israel to remain in Jewish hands. If someone does sell his field to a non-Jew, then he has to buy every year bikurim and bring them. In other words, the original owner, even though you sold your land, really the land is still holy, and although you sold it legally for some purposes, nevertheless you retain the land retains the sanctity, and you're responsible to go and buy the bikurim every year. And this is tikun ha'olam, because that way every year you're going to have to go spend money to buy the bikurim. It will be a yearly reminder that you should really try to buy the land back, and you should not have sold it in the first place. And so therefore, instead of spending that money every year to buy the bikurim, maybe you will actually go and buy the land back. Okay, that's all one version of the Mishnah. There are other versions that seem to be older and original that leave out this vav, and it makes important difference. In this reading, someone who sells his land to a non-Jew, lokeach, if a Jew buys it back, then the Jew who buys it back has to bring bikurim, even though the fruit grew while it was under non-Jewish ownership. Nevertheless, once the Jew buys it, then he has to bring bikurim. And this would also be mipnei tikun ha'olam. A little hard to figure out what's the tikun ha'olam, but it seems to be the same idea, that even though it was under non-Jewish ownership, nevertheless, it's still liable in bikurim. The non-Jewish ownership does not take away its sanctity, and that would be also a reminder that this still has sanctity, and it should be best that if it's owned, best for it to be owned by a Jew. Okay, that's the Mishnah, and now we're going to see an important machloket. Amar Rabba, Afa pi she'en kinyan legoy be'eretz Yisrael lehafkiya midei ma'aser, shene'emar ki li ha'ares, li kedushat ha'ares. So Rabba says that when a non-Jew buys land in Israel, that is not a full sale in terms of its halacha. Halachically, we consider it still under the ownership of a Jew, such that anything that grows on it, you have to bring maaser and bikurim and everything else, because the pasuk says, all the land belongs to me, Hashem, meaning that it still retains its holiness. Therefore, anything that grows while it's under non-Jewish ownership, if a Jew would buy that produce, he would have to make sure that somehow teruma, maaser, bikurim is being taken from it. אבל יש קניין לגוי בארץ ישראל לחפור בה בורות שכינו מערות שנאמר השמיים שמיים לאדוני והארץ נתן לבני אדם. However, the purchase of the non-Jew is effective in terms of usage, that the non-Jew can come and he can dig it, ditches, caves, whatever he wants, even things that are not very good for the land. That's what he wants to do with it, then he's allowed to, because it says the heavens belong to Hashem, but the earth belongs to humans, and therefore you're selling him the legal right of usage, but he does not own the halachic holiness of the land, and therefore anything that grows still is liable to ma'aser. Not that the non-Jew is going to care and he's not going to take ma'aser before he eats it, but the point is that any produce of his land that goes to a Jew, you will have to take ma'aser. That's the opinion of Rabbah. Rabbi Elazar Omer, אף על פי שיש קניין לגוי בארץ ישראל להפקיע מידי מעשר, שנאמר דגנך ולא דגן גוי, אבל אין קניין לגוי בארץ ישראל לחפור בה בורות שכינו מערות, שנאמר להשם הארץ ומלואה. Rabbi Elazar says the opposite of Rabbah. Even though the non-Jew does acquire the land of Eretz Yisrael to the extent of to remove its holiness and remove the obligation of bringing maaser, because it says regarding maaser, you have to bring maaser of your grain, meaning only if you own it, but not if it's owned by a Jew. So according to the Rabbi Elazar, in fact, this land owned by a non-Jew is you're not required to bring maaser or bikurim or anything else. But the ownership of a non-Jew is not for usage, because it says Lashem haaretz umlo'ah. When we say haaretz in the pashat of the pasuk, it's talking about the whole world belongs to God. Tebel v'yosh beba. But in this derasha, we're saying haaretz meaning the land of Israel, all belongs to Hashem, and therefore the non-Jew can't just use it however he wants. But we have to have proper zoning laws to make sure he's using it in a productive way and not just digging holes in it and ruining it. Okay, so is the opposite. Now we're going to see why is this relevant to us. We're going to see in a few minutes that the Gemara is going to show that this Mishnah seems to support Rabbi Elazar, because the Mishnah says, as a takana, the rabbis made an enactment and said, listen, if you buy the land from a non-Jew after it all grew with the non-Jew, and you buy it, you still have to make sure to bring bikurim. But sounds like that's only because of a takana. Without the takana, from the letter of the law, it does not have holiness, and you would not have to bring ma'aser. And so that would support Rabbi Elazar against Rabbah. So we're going to bring that as a challenge in a few minutes. Okay, but first, let's explain their machloket. B'may kami palge, mor saba deganecha velo dagan goy, or mor saba digunecha velo digun goy. Rabbi Elazar, who is of the opinion that the non-Jew, when a non-Jew owns land, it is not liable to ma'aser, and it does not have that holiness anymore. So he interprets deganecha, as he already said in his own words, that it means your grain is liable to ma'aser, but if it belongs to a non-Jew, then it's not liable to ma'aser. That's how he interprets that pasuk. However, Rabbah is going to interpret differently, and he says, no, don't read it deganecha, but rather digunecha, which means your accumulation or your pile. The law is that if a Jew owns land and produce, while it's being processed, he doesn't yet have to give maaser. It's only when he's finished the processing, piles it all up and smooths out the pile, then he's liable to maaser. So Rabbah is understanding here that if a non-Jew owns land and it grows under his ownership and then a Jew buys it, since it's being piled under the Jew, he has to bring maaser. Even though he was owned by a non-Jew while it was growing, he can't say, "Oh, it's owned by a non-Jew, so it's exempt." No, because according to Rabbah, it's never exempt. The holiness of the land remains even when the non-Jew owns it, and therefore the Jew who buys it has to then bring maaser when it's piled up. Okay, so that's the source of their machloket. Amar Rabbah, mina and mina la. Rabbah says, I have a proof from a Mishnah. Titanan, Mishnah and Pe'ah. Haleket v'ashichecha v'ape'ah shel goy chayavim v'maaser ela imken hifkir. Now, the law of leket shicha and pe'ah, if a Jew owns a farm and they forgot a couple of grains or a whole pile, a whole sheaf, then it has to be left for the poor, and the corner also has to be left for the poor. Now, these items, when the Jew owns it, he basically is making it hefker. He's saying, listen, any poor person who wants to come and take it, they can come and take these things. Because it's hefker, it's not liable to maaser. The poor person that takes the leket shicha and pe'ah does not have to bring maaser on it, because it doesn't belong to him or to anyone. Okay, so that's the basic law. Now this law is teaching that when you have leket pe'ah of a non-Jew, we're going to analyze what this means. Does that mean that it's the non-Jew owns the land and a Jew took the grain, or the other way around? That a Jew owns the land and a non-Jew took the grain. Okay, we'll see what that means, and then we'll understand the proof better. But anyway, the point of the Mishnah is that you have to bring Maaseh. In other words, it's not called hefked unless the owner actually makes it hefked. So let's see. Let's analyze. Hechidameh ilema di Israel v'liktinhu goy elem ken hefked hamifked v'kaimeh. If it's talking about a case of that the Jew owns the land, and then he said, okay, here's pe'ah, anyone can come and take it. And then a non-Jew came and took that, whatever, he's poor or not poor, doesn't know the law, whatever. A non-Jew takes it. And so in that case, you have to bring ma'aser, unless the owner makes it hefked. That wouldn't make any sense because the owner already made it hefked by designating this is pe'ah, this is shicha. He said whoever wants to takes it. So he already made it hefked. This line of the Mishnah wouldn't make sense. Elalav de goy v'liktinu Yisrael. Rather, it must be that it's talking about a non-Jew owns the land, and poor Jews are coming. It's non-Jew, even though he's not chayav pe'ah, but I guess he's a nice guy, and he likes this law, and he leaves a corner for poor people, and the poor people come and take it. They have to bring maaser. Why? Because when the non-Jew designates the corner, he doesn't really know all the laws. He's not actually doing it halachically and making it hefked necessarily. He may just be saying, okay, this is, like you Jews do. Here's a corner. So some Jews come and take it. Now this is actually owned by a non-Jew, and nevertheless, the Mishnah says chayavin be'maaser. So we can prove from here that grain, that even though it's owned by a non-Jew, you have to take maaser. It retains its holiness. That's a proof for Rabbah. Unless the non-Jew makes it hefked. If the non-Jew knows how to do that and makes it hefked and everyone can take it, then okay, then fine. It'll be same as if a Jew owns it and makes it hefked. Since it's not owned by anybody, you don't have to bring maaser. But if the non-Jew keeps ownership of it, then the Jew who takes it has to bring maaser. Proof for Rabbah. But right, tamad hefkir, halo hefkir hayav. It's only exempt if he makes it hefked. But if the non-Jew keeps ownership over it, then you have to bring maaser. So you see that the land retains its holiness even while it's owned by a non-Jew, and Jews that take that produce have to bring maaser. That seems like a good proof. And that's going to be a challenge to the Elazar. What are we going to do? La le'olam d'Yisrael ve'liktinhu goy. U'dekamat ha'mifkiri ve'kaimi nehi de'mifkiri da'ata d'Yisrael adata de'goy mi mifkiri. The Elazar could say, no, I interpret this Mishnah that is talking about the Jew owns the land, and then some non-Jew came and took some of the grain. And it would be chayab b'maaser. Why? Now, even though you asked the question and you said, wait, it's already considered hefked, because the Jew said this is for any poor people to take. Yeah, when the Jew made it hefked, he had in mind that poor Jewish people would take it. Generally, that's who's going to come around. He didn't make it hefked for a non-Jew to take it, and so therefore, from the non-Jew's perspective, he took something that's still owned by a Jew. Since it's still owned, maaser has to be taken. Not that the non-Jew is going to care about the maaser, but if that non-Jew then would, let's say, sell it to a Jew, the Jew would say, where'd you get that from? Oh, I took it from pe'ah, from that Jew's garden. I says, oh, you took it from pe'ah, but that owner didn't have in mind that it should be hefked for you, so he still has ownership, and therefore it is still liable in maaser, and therefore there's no proof from here for Rabbah's position. That's how Rabbi Elazar defends himself. Okay, another proof. Tashema. Yisrael shelakach sadeh migoy עד שלא הביא השליש וחזר ומחרה לו משהביא השליש חייבת במעשר שכבר נתחייבה אין לא נתחייבה לו. A Jew that buys a field from a non-Jew when the grain is not yet a third grown, and then he sells it back to the non-Jew after a third is grown. A third, that's a key time when it becomes a third grown. That's when a liability for responsibility for Maaseh kicks in. Okay, even though you don't have to actually give the Maaseh until you finish processing and it fills the pile, but it's important to have ownership over it at that point that it grows that critical step. So even though he sold it back to a non-Jew, he already became liable to bring Maaseh because the Jew owned it during that time. So we see that Nitchayeva'in, only because he owned it during that time, that's why he is liable. But if he didn't own it during that time, then he would not be liable. This is a proof for the El Azar that land owned by a non-Jew is not liable in Maaseh, and it's a challenge to Rabbah. How's Rabbah going to deal with this? Baraita, hacha b'maiskinan beSuria v'kasabar kibush yachid la'sheme kibush. Rabbah could say this Baraita is talking about not land in Israel, but land in Syria. The law in Syria is that it's midrabanan. The rabbi said you have to take to the man Maaseh from this land in Syria if you're Jewish. But that Rabbanan only extends to Jewish-owned land. Non-Jewish-owned land in Syria, the rabbis did not make such a law. So if it's owned by non-Jews in Syria, then it does not have to at all. Even Rabbah would agree that if it's owned by a non-Jew, there's no need to bring it. And that's so he says, this Baraita could be talking about in Syria. All right, a similar question and answer. Again, Tashema. Yisrael vegoy shelachu sadeh beshutafut. You have a Jew and a non-Jew that jointly own a field. So now, what are you going to do with the produce? Do you have to bring Taruma Maaser? So the law is a machloket. Tebel becholin me'uravin ze bazeh divrei Rabbi. Rabbi said all of the produce, every single grain, is a mixture of tebel and cholin. The part that's owned by a Jew is tebel, meaning you have to bring Taruma Maaser. The part that's owned by a non-Jew is cholin. You don't have to bring it. Okay, that's according to the B. Now, so according to the B, you're going to have to still take Taruma Maaser from other produce that's of the same type, because it's only half. You can't use full tebel to redeem half tebel, and so you'll have to do that. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel omer shel goy patur v'shel Yisrael hayav. Rashbag says, here's what you do. You let it grow, and then the two partners are going to eventually split it, and they'll say, here, you get this pile, and you get that pile. Once you split it, then it will retroactively be clarified through berera that the pile that ends up in the ownership of the non-Jew will be cholin. You don't have to bring to the Maaser, and the pile that will belong to the Jew will be fully tebel and chayab and to the Maaser. So that's the machloket about how exactly you're going to split it up. So now the Gemara comments. Ad kan la peligya ela de mosabar yesh berera mosabar yen berera. The only machloket here is whether you can say there is retroactive definition. And so the second opinion of Rashbag says, yes, you can retroactively designate it, whereas the B says, no, there is no retroactive designation, since you both jointly own it. So then every single grain is going to be half tebel and half cholin. Aval dekule alma yesh kinyan legoy beretz Yisrael afkiya miyad maaser. But you see that they agree on the basic point that if a non-Jew owns land in Israel, he does not have to bring maaser, right? The non-Jewish ownership removes that sanctity, and no one has to bring maaser. This is a proof for the opinion of Rabbi Elazar and against Rabbah. Rabbah, how are you going to interpret this source? Hachaname beSuria v'kasabar kibush yachid la'sheme kibush. You can say the same thing. We're talking about this whole source is talking about land in Syria, and because it was only conquered by an individual, by David HaMelech, but was not part of the national borders that was conquered by the entire public, by the entire nation. Therefore, it's not an official conquest. It was never fully annexed as part of Israel, and so it doesn't have the deoraita status of the land of Israel. Rather, it's only midrabanan that the rabbi said, listen, it's kind of like a part of Israel, and we're going to treat it with that sanctity. And if a Jew owns land in Syria, he has to bring to the Maaser. But if a non-Jew owns it, does not have to. And therefore, Everyone would agree, Rabba as well, that in this case that it's in Syria, the half that's owned by a non-Jew will not be required to bring maaser. Amar Rav Chia bar Avin, Tashema, hamocher sadeo legoy lokech umevi bikurim, mipnei tikun haolam, mipnei tikun haolam, in midoraita la. Here's the moment we've been waiting for. Rabbi Chia bar Avin brings our Mishnah as a challenge and says, the Mishnah says, if you sell your field to a non-Jew, lokech, anyone who buys the field will have to bring bikurim. This proof here really makes sense only if you don't have a vav. And so, at least makes sense better if you don't have the vav. So that seems to be the original reading. Anyone who buys the field will have to bring bikurim because of tikkun olam. Meaning, that's only because of tikkun olam that the rabbi said, listen, if you purchased the field from a non-Jew in the middle of while it was growing, then you should bring bikurim. That means it's only because of the enactment, Mambedoraita, you would not have to, even though the non-Jew owned it. Because the non-Jew owned it, he removes the sanctity of it, and on the Doraita level, you would not have to bring Ma'aser. This is again a proof for Rabbi Elazar against Rabbah, right? Rabbah, how can you, according to Rabbah, you should say that on the Doraita level, the Jew who buys it has to bring the bikurim. Amar Rav Ashi, shete takanut havu meikara havu maite medoraita. Rav Ashi is going to come to the rescue of Rabbah and explain that actually there were two steps in this enactment. The original law, in fact, was, as Rabbah said, if a Jew buys land from a non-Jew, then he has to bring maaser, because it was liable to maaser the whole time. The land of Israel retains its sanctity. A non-Jewish buying it does not remove the sanctity. Doraita level you have to. However, kevan de hazu de kamakre umizabene desabre biktushatahu kaiman takinu lehu de la letu. The rabbi saw that the people that would buy land from non-Jews or buy produce from non-Jews, they would bring the bikurim and say the whole mikra bikurim, right? Thank you for this produce, for the land that you brought us to this land, Hashem, and you gave us this produce. And so, since they're bringing bikurim, they reason that, you see, the land remains holy, even though it's sold to a non-Jew. And so, they had no problem selling their land to a non-Jew. Okay, so what? The non-Jew owns it, but the land is still sanctified. And so people were more easily selling their land to non-Jews. So the rabbi said, this is not good. You know, we're going to make a takana that if the land is owned by a non-Jew, a Jew is not allowed to bring the bikurim, right? To show them, and then they'll feel bad. Oh, look at this fruit. It's grew in Israel, and with no one saying bikurim, and we can't say mikra bikurim, and we can't bring the bikurim. Oh, we really feel bad. Because then they'll have a sense that it's losing its sanctity. So that was the takana, the point of the takana, even though it's really required to do bikurim. The rabbi said, Sheva al te'aseh, no, don't bring bikurim, so that you will feel bad and hopefully not sell the land in the first place. However, this takana backfired. Kevan de chazu deman de la segi le mizaban vekam ishtake'an beyad goyim hadar takinu lehu deletu. Then they saw, look, people, even though they feel bad about it, some people are down and out and they don't have money to pay back and they have to sell the land to a non-Jew. And so they end up selling the land to a non-Jew and no one is buying it back because they say, well, okay, now it belongs to the non-Jew, so now it's not sanctified anymore, and they forget about it. So they made another takana, and they said, let's go back to the original law and say that actually you have to bring mikra bikurim because we want people to stay connected to it. And therefore, if they go and when they buy the land or buy produce from the non-Jew, they bring bikurim, they'll say, oh, see, the land still has sanctity. And now look, it's being owned by a non-Jew, but it's sanctified. You know what? We should really try hard to buy the land back so that we can have full ownership and bring everything properly. And so this was takana is in fact, according to Rabbah, it isn't takana, even though the takana is the same as the original Doraita law. But in the meantime, it went through a reverse takana. That takana didn't work, and so they brought the takana that the Mishnah is talking about is actually an undoing of the takana of the first takana to go back to the original law. But in fact, yes, it is required on the Doraita level also for the Jew to bring maaser on produce, even though it was owned by a non-Jew. Okay, good. Now another machloket, itmar. המוכר שדהו לפירות. רבי יוחנן אמר מביא וקורא, ריש לקיש אמר מביא ואינו קורא. Someone who sells his field only for the produce. In other words, I keep ownership of the land itself, and I'm selling you the right to work the land and to take the produce for this season or for the next 10 seasons, right? I'm pre-selling to you everything that will grow on the land from now. So who brings, what about the bikurim? Well, the owner of the land can't bring the bikurim because he doesn't own the fruit. So rather, the buyer who buys the fruit, he can bring bikurim, and Rabbi Yochanan says he brings it and he can recite the mikra bikurim. Even though in the mikra bikurim it says, the land that you gave me, he doesn't really own the land, but Rabbi Yochanan says nevertheless he can still say it because he owns the land for the purpose of the fruit. Reish Lakish says he has to bring bikurim because you still have to bring bikurim, but you can't recite this land that you've given me because he doesn't own the land. Okay, that's a machloket. Rabbi Yochanan amar mevi v'koreh kinyan perot ke kinyan haguf tameh. Rabbi Yochanan explains further that you can recite the whole mikra bikurim because ownership of the fruit is like ownership of the land. If you have ownership over anything that grows on the land, it means for that season, basically, I own the land. I'm kind of renting the land, so it's in my possession right now, and then it'll go back to you whenever the agreement is over. Reish Lakish says, no, it's not the same. You got the fruit. Okay, go take the fruit, enjoy it. But the land is owned by the owner of the land, so the guy who has the fruit cannot say, thank you Hashem for the land that you have given me. Okay, challenge. Itibe Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish. Ul betecha melamed she'adam mevi bikure ishto vekore. Rabbi Yochanan challenges Reish Lakish from this pasuk that says in the end of Mikra Bikurim, it says V'samachta bechol hatov, you should enjoy all the good that Hashem has given to you, ul betecha, and to your household. Now, the household is going to come to teach that you have the following case. A wife brings into the marriage nichse melog, she brings in land. Nichse melog means she retains ownership of the land throughout the marriage, and at the end of the marriage she can take the land back itself. So she is the owner of the land. While they're married, the husband has the right to take the fruits. So this is exactly the same as the case of the machloket. And yet we learn from this pasuk that the husband brings the bikurim and he recites it. He can recite it. Thank you for the land that you've given me, even though the husband doesn't own the land. And so Rabbi Yochanan says, see, that's a good proof for me that someone who only owns the fruit but not the land still recites mikra bikurim. What are you going to do about that, Reish Lakish? Amar le, shane hatam dichtiv ul betecha. Reish Lakish says that's the exception to the rule, precisely because the pasuk says ul betecha, goes out of its way to say that, listen, if you own the fruit but the land is part of your household because it's owned by your wife, then since it's all part of one household, ishto kegufo, so then yes, you're like the owner, and that's good enough, and you can say mikra bikurim. But we need a pasuk to go out of its way to say only in this case, but otherwise, if you're not married to the owner, then you cannot say mikra bikurim. So it actually works perfectly for Reish Lakish. Okay, that's one version of this exchange. Another version flips it around. Vika da'amre iti Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish Rabbi Yochanan ul betecha melamed she'adam mevi bikure ishto vekore hatam hu dichtiv ul betecha ava be'alma la. In this version, Reish Lakish is actually as challenging Rabbi Yochanan. The pasuk says ul betecha, and that means that a husband can say mikra bikurim even though his wife owns the land. So you see that only in this case, because we have a special exception that says ul betecha, that's why the husband can say mikra bikurim. But in any other case, where they're not married and one person owns the land and another person buys the right to the fruit, the person that owns the right to the fruit cannot say mikra bikurim. So Reish Lakish says that's a proof for my position. What are you going to do about that, Rabbi Yochanan? Amar le tamadidi name mehachek amina. Rabbi Yochanan says I treat that not as an exception, but that's the rule, right? Ul betecha teaches it in this case, and it's the same in all cases. Anytime you have not only because they're in the same household. Anytime you have one person who owns the land, one person who takes the fruit, the person who has the fruit can say Mikra Bikurim and actually learn it from this very source. So that's interesting, right? They both agree on that one, what that one pasuk means, what that one word means. But is that the rule or is that the exception to the rule? Okay, and now, Re'itibe. היה בא בדרך וביקורי אשתו בידו ושמע שמתה אשתו מביא וקורא מתה אין לא מתה לה. So one last challenge of Reish Lakish against Rabbi Yochanan. Here we have a baraita that says if someone was a husband, he's on the way to bring the bikurim of the bikurim of his wife's land, the land of the nechse melog of his wife's land that she brought into the marriage, but he has the right to the fruit, and he is coming on the way to bring his bikurim to Yerushalayim, and he hears in the middle of his trip that his wife has died. Now, as soon as his wife dies, he inherits his wife's property. So now the land belongs to him. So therefore, he can bring the bikurim and he can recite, "Thank you, Hashem, for the land that you have given me." So what do we can learn from this braita? Only if she died, then he can say the Mikra Bikurim. But if she did not die, then he cannot say it. And so that is a challenge to Rabbi Yochanan. So we can answer for Rabbi Yochanan, who hadin da'afagav de lo meta. No, the truth is, even if she didn't die, he would still be able to say it. Umeta istadich aleh. So why does the Braita say only if she died? No, it's saying also if she died, and we have to learn that law. Not only if she's alive, then the husband can say Mikra Bikurim, but also if she died, because otherwise I might have thought Sakadatecha mina ligzor mishum de Rabbi Yosef bar Chanina. Tamar Rabbi Yosef bar Chanina besaran ושגרן ביד שליח, ומת שליח בדרך, מביא ואינו קורא, שנאמר ולקחת והבאת, עד שתלקיחה והבאה באחד, כמשמע לן. Rabbi Yosef bar Chanina says a rule that if someone sent his bikurim with an agent, and the agent died on the way, and then someone else will actually bring the fruit within the Bet HaMikdash and present it to the Kohen, then he cannot recite it. Now, if the agent did the whole thing, then that would be fine, because you can send an agent to do this mitzvah, but it has to be the same person. Since the pasuk says v'lakachta, you will take it and you will bring it. So the person that takes it along the way can also present it to the Kohen, but it has to be the same one person. If the shaliach does half the job and then dies, the one who finishes the job cannot say the Mikra Bikurim. And now, I might have thought that I should apply that to this case, where you have the husband, he is on his way as a kind of like a shaliach on behalf of the wife, because she owns the land, but she's bringing it, and if he did the whole thing, fine, he could say Mikra Bikurim. However, if she dies in the middle, now he is no longer acting as a shaliach, but now he's acting as the owner. So I might have thought, oh, look, see, it's not the same person. It's the same person physically, but it's not in the same role that he brought it there and is actually giving it to the Kohen. I might have thought that if she dies in the middle, then he cannot say it. And that's why this baraita has to come and teach me that even if she dies in the middle, still he can say it. But it doesn't mean that if she didn't die, he couldn't say it. If she's alive, also he can say it. And therefore, we resolve the question according to everyone. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen ve'amen.